I am Renee McMillian Clark, a member of the Arts and Letters Committee of the Metropolitan Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. To our honored guests, members of the Divine Nine sororities and fraternities, friends, family, colleagues, and supporters, welcome, or shall we say, caribou, which is welcome in Swahili. We send greetings to you on behalf of the Arts and Letters and Social Action Committee of the Metropolitan Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We are here to reflect, honor, and discuss the movie Teal, selected as one of the Delta Red Carpet Films by the National Arts and Letters Commission of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We hope while together this evening, you lean into the conversation, get inspired by the artistry, and sink into the touching conversation with our guest producer and co-writer of Teal, Mr. Keith Beauchamp. Maya Angelou once said, "You can't really know where you are going until you know where you have been." So let's look at the angels in history that we are discussing today. Emmett Till and his mother, Mrs. Till Mobley. To our honored guests, members of the Divine Nine sororities and fraternities, excuse me, I apologize for that. These pictures captivate Black love and Black boy joy all in one view. As you can see, his smile could light up any room, and the love shared between Emmett and Mrs. Till Mobley was powerful, especially in these pictures. And though Emmett was taken from her, the love of his mother lived on to be one of the greatest love stories of all. Here are some additional history about Emmett and Mrs. Till Mobley. Emmett Louis Till, a 14-year-old who was brutally murdered in August 1955 in a racially charged incident where he was accused of offending a white woman while visiting family in Money, Mississippi. Days later, he was kidnapped, beaten, shot, and mutilated by relatives of the woman who killed him before disposing of his remains in the Tallahatchie River. Mrs. Mamie Elizabeth Till Mobley, the only child born to John and Alma Carthen, came into this world by way of a small town near Webb, Mississippi. Ironically, she was born just 2 miles from the town of Sumter, where the murder trial would one day be held for her only son. She was a devoted wife and mother who was thrusted into American history by the hateful acts that took Emmett. She was relentless in pursuing justice for her son. And though a distraught mother, she insisted on a public open casket burial for Emmett in order to bring attention to the violence against Black people in the South. Allow me to say that again, to the violence against the Black people in the South. Her sentiment to expose the monstrous crime committed against Emmett is what shocked the nation and helped to fuel the growing civil rights movement. Mrs. Till Mobley's desire was to share his history and have people to learn from it. And in addition to people learning about what happened to Emmett, she wanted people to understand what she always thought her son should represent, and that his name stood for healing, reconciliation, forgiveness, and hope. As we reflect on the film, it depicts the events that lead to Mrs. Till Mobley's civil rights activism through her own eyes. Till also detailing the driving forces of Mrs. Till Mobley's decision as a mother seeking justice for her son. Now that we know a bit more about Emmett and Mrs. Till Mobley, let's get inspired through the art of poetry.
Thank you. How y'all doing? My name is Misha McCoy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and this is my poem, Nameless. I don't know what to do with this rage. I feel inflamed. Existing in a constant state of test my luck, it's like this can't be reality. Decisions are being made on behalf of me by 6 people far removed from the consequence. Can we take a moment to make it make sense? My week started with an unwarranted conversation about plantations that concluded with me offering unpaid labor in the form of education, only to crawl to the end of my week and have my right to justice swept from under my feet. And I see something on the horizon, but I'm scared to peek because I fear Monday may bring threats to my ability to create the family I seek. It seems as if everybody and their granddaddy got something personal against different people manifesting their different dreams, and the collateral damage doesn't even matter. You say all lives matter, yet so many aren't a factor, and it's so frustrating to engage in collaboration while we skate around the situations. I just need help figuring out what to do with this rage. Existing in a constant state of test my luck, it's like this can't be reality. Life is like a Jordan Peele movie. We're here for their amusement, navigating a simulation that's the product of a white man's imagination manifested through my ancestors' blood, sweat, and tears. While they were banned from the very buildings they built for years, it's hard to celebrate that we've come so far when you're constantly dealing with the nuances of where we are, all while trying to lead a better life. Baby, you're asking us to eat cereal with a knife. It sounds pretty impossible, huh? Like your tongue will get sliced with each and every bite, and the milk just slides right off. It's not even there to soothe the scars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Misha McCoy. I am Nicole Janelle Horn, and I am the co-chair of the Arts and Letters Committee for the Metropolitan Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Can we give a big round of applause to Misha, a virtual round of applause? You know, Mrs. Misha McCoy, just a little bit more about her. She's a scholar and an activist that uses education and creative expression to dismantle oppressive norms and promote identity exploration. Much of her work is actually done through her business, Misha's Room, or her nonprofit Queer Wellness Network. Now, if you want to hear more from Misha, you can take a look at your chat and you'll be able to contact her, book her, and hear a little bit more about what she does. Again, thank you, Misha. So when we think about how excited I am tonight and honored to introduce the producer and co-writer of the film Till, Mr. Keith Beauchamp, I cannot contain myself. I'm going to do my best to do so. So let me tell you a little bit about Keith. Keith Beauchamp is an award-winning filmmaker, producer, writer, director, and host. He attended Southern University in Baton Rouge, where he studied criminal justice with the intention of becoming a civil rights attorney. Now, As a young boy in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, it's kind of how we say it, Beauchamp had his share of run-ins with racism, but it wasn't until an incident where he was assaulted by an undercover police officer after dancing with a white classmate. This was at a party, and he felt compelled to fight racism. Now, Keith has been featured on numerous award-winning news and documentary shows like 60 Minutes, MSNBC, Good Morning America, and CNN. Additionally, he's been featured in hundreds of publications around the world. Publications like New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and Associated Press, and the Chicago Sun-Times. His past work includes TV One's Murder in Black and White, hosted by Reverend Al Sharpton, BET's Exceptional Black Woman, and he's the former executive producer and host of Investigative Discovery award-winning crime reality series, The Injustice Files. And of course, we all know that he is the producer of the film Till, which he actually co-produced with Whoopi Goldberg, who stars as Alma, as Till Mobley's mother. Lastly, I wanted to share that he constantly had an opportunity to work closely with Till's mother, Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley. He actually became a friend and a mentor of his. She became a friend and mentor of his until her death in 2003. The untold story of Emmett Lewis Till was released in 2005, and his research and advocacy led to reopening of the Till case in 2004. And this was closed again after finding no new evidence. So without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Keith Beauchamp.
Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. I'm so happy to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Keith. We're so glad to have you. And we're just really glad to hear from you. And we want to know more. So let's go ahead and set the stage. Would you mind telling us about your personal pursuit to justice?
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to thank you, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, for this platform. I am a son of a Delta. And so I like to brag about that being the product of a Delta, because that's where my discipline comes from. So I think my mother may be online. So Ciola Beauchamp, or Beauchamp, however you want to be recognized today, please, I know you're here and watching. But I come to you today, not alone, but in the spirit of my dear friend, the late Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley, and the legacy of our son, Emmett Lewis Till, for I believe if not for the death of Emmett Till and the courageous actions of my Shiro, there would be no Keith Beauchamp filmmaker today. And without those who have lost their lives throughout this continuous civil rights struggle, we all would not have a path to follow. But my journey with Emmett Till took place when I was just 10 years old. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as my bio stated, and I was in my parents' study going through old vintage magazines that they kept over the years. And as I opened up one of the magazines that just so happened to be a Jet magazine, I came upon the story of Emmett Till. And on one side of this page, there's this angelic face of this young little boy, sort of a mirror image of myself at that time. And then on the adjacent page was this horrific face of this monster that I could not really wrap my head around what I was looking at. So I'm sitting there with the magazine in my hand, with my mouth open, and my parents just so happened to walk by at the same time, and my mother looked in on me, and she sees me with my mouth open, so she walks in and she looks over my shoulder, and she finds that I discovered the horrific photograph of Till. Then she calls my father into the study, and I remember them looking at each other saying, I think it's time to tell him the story. So throughout my life, the name Emmett Till kept resurfacing. When I got into high school, I was interracially dating. And the first thing my parents would tell me before I left the house at night was, don't let what happened to Emmett Till happen to you. So it became a boogeyman story or educational tool to teach me about the racism that still exists in this country today. But as my bio stated, it wasn't until I had my real run-in with racism where things began to change for me. At a pre-graduation party 2 weeks before my graduation, I had my own run-in with racism when I was assaulted by an undercover police officer for dancing with a white classmate of mine. And that's what spurred me into wanting to fight injustice, but I felt the only way that could be possible if I became a part of a system to fight it in some way. So that's when I decided that, that I would actually study criminal justice at Southern University of Baton Rouge in hopes of becoming a civil rights attorney, but then towards, in my sophomore year, towards my junior year of college, I was introduced to filmmaking by my best friend who had moved to New York City and started working with his sister who had her own film production company. So I went back, told my parents, look, let me sit out a semester or two. I don't know if this is something that I would like to do, but I wanted to hang with my best friend and see what they were doing in New York. And I set out a semester and I realized that we were doing a lot of video production at that time, where I began to hone in my skills of writing and producing. And it was at a company meeting one evening, I was asked if there was a story that I would want to tell, what story would that be? And of course, Emmett Till came foremost in my mind, the name that I heard for most of my life. And so after making that decision, we also had this crazy dialogue that was happening at the time about appropriation, who are allowed to tell our stories. And we also had a generational rift that was going on as well, with some of our civil rights elders questioning the motives of the new generation and what are we doing to contribute to the movement. So this is where I'm birthed into this world with a new life, becoming an unintentional filmmaker in the midst of trying to fight for justice for Emmett. But I met Mother Mobley, I call her, Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett's mother. I met her in late 1995. I had a side job, just like many of us who have big dreams in mind and don't really have the backing of, to support yourself. But I had a side job when I moved to New York. We did the music video and film thing on the weekend, but my job was at Estee Lauder headquarters. I was one of few men who worked at the headquarters in their legal department. And it was at that point when I made the decision that I would call Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley, because if I wanted to move forward in telling this story, there was no way I could do it without the family. And so I recall going online, unlike how instantly information comes to us today. It was a dial-up situation. If you recall how you had to use to dial up when we use the internet. And so I had to do the same thing at the office. And sure enough, I came across a webpage of the Emmett Till Foundation, which had the number of Mother Mobley's at the bottom. And I reached out to the webmaster to make sure that the number on the webpage was actually correct. And that's when I made the big call. I picked up the phone, dialed the number. Late Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley picks up the phone, and I immediately hang up in her face. Yes, I hung up in Mamie Till Mobley's face. Oh, no. And the reason being is because I was young, I was afraid. I didn't know what type of life she had lived. I had not followed her throughout my life in terms of, having Emmett Till part of my makeup, but I knew nothing about her at the time that I reached out besides what I read. I didn't know if it was going to be a bad day for her. I didn't know she was still mourning the loss of her son in a manner where she wouldn't want to communicate with me. I just didn't want to open up old wounds. But after hanging up in her face, I felt so bad, because this is what was not the reasoning for me to sit out a semester or two to just mess up my life and not pursue the dreams that I foresaw. But I picked up the phone again, and I called her, and she immediately picks up, and I quickly apologize. And she could sense that I was nervous. Mind you, I'm in my early 20s. And so I'm like speaking to this iconic woman on the other end. And I just didn't know what to tell her besides the fact of how Emmett became sort of my kindred spirit throughout my life. And I told her the story, how I was introduced to the case, her son's case, and how much I wanted to help in some way to make sure that justice prevails, because of course we knew at that time no one was brought to justice. And so that conversation, the first time we were on the phone, lasted for 2.5 hours. And we finally met each other in 1996, 2 weeks before Christmas. I went to her home in Chicago, the south side of Chicago. And as I recall, and I'm thinking now, driving up to our home, my best friend was with me, and we had a taxi driver drive us from O'Hare Airport. So he kind of knew the address of Mother Mobley already. And we had this long discussion all the way there about the impact Mother Mobley was continuing to have on society, and how important it is to make sure that she is not forgotten, because many of us believe, and we know now, that she was the mother of the civil rights movement. And that's the way I looked at it. So we get to her house. I'm sorry, I get long-winded when I talk about the story. I don't get a chance to talk about it as much. But we get to her home, and I'm escorted through her home by a cousin. And while I'm walking through the living room, I see all these familiar faces of Emmett Till and family members. And I see Mother Mobley in the kitchen from a distance, and she had this big smile upon her face. And the way she would describe our relationship, meeting for the first time, and if she was here, she would say that it was sort of like a love affair of meeting for the first time, because she pretty much knew everything about me by that time. And she herself filled the void of me losing my grandmother. And then I heard her often say in interviews that I kind of feel that void of not taking Emmett's place, but being the son that, of course, that she lost. And so that relationship lasted for 8.5 years until she took her last breath. But she was my inspiration in joining in on her fight to get justice for Emmett Till. And of course, that led me to become an intentional filmmaker along the way. And so it is an honor and a pleasure to be here to speak about this journey, but most importantly, about the great Shiro, the late Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley, which everyone should know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Keith, for sharing that really touching and amazing story. And I'm glad you gave us all the details because those are the things that we don't know. And when it comes down to the relationship that you have with her, that's what matters. And that's the seed that was planted for you. And so I remember you telling me, that when you were 22, you began this mission. And, for the Deltas on the line, the number 22 is a very intentional number. So we don't believe that, your journey, it was intentional. So thank you so much for sharing. And so Keith, we want to get to know you a little bit more. So I'm sure you can see on the screen somebody you might be familiar with. And so as you're looking at this picture, can you just give us a little snippet on this time? What was going on? Were you all around the table? Was it some good cooking going on?
This was in 1996, our first meeting. This picture.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
You can see how young I am. I didn't have all the gray at the time.
You look exactly
the same. But that was
Mr.
Mobley on the right of myself, and of course the late Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley on the other end. Very nice. That was the start of a great relationship that I will always cherish for the rest of my life. Mother Mobley was, not only great by her story and her journey, but she was probably the most prolific person I would ever meet in my lifetime. Next to my mother, there was no one else who had been such an influence on my life. And so she was a major influence for me. She opened my eyes to many of the things that I was blinded to. Through her, I learned a lot about faith. I learned a lot about being persistent and perseverance, because all these things I needed along the way for my 29-year journey to get to this point. And so I don't think people realize how much time I actually invested. I'm 51 years old. Over half of my life has been dedicated to telling this story, because this is a story that should never be forgotten. And to be honest, there's no other story that speaks more to this generation, political and racial climate, than the story of Emmett Lewis Till. And these are the things that Mother Mobley was trying to instill in me when I was so young and just being the sponge. But now that I'm older and I'm wiser and I've grown a lot, I understand now what she has always been trying to tell me along the way. And that was the thing. I mean, and if I may, I get long-winded, Nicole, so you're going to have to stop me.
You're good. You're good.
But there was things that she would always say to me that I didn't quite understand then, but I understand even more now. And those things she would often say to me, Keith, we must continuously tell Emmett's story until man's consciousness is risen, because only then that would mean justice for Emmett Till. For the longest time, I did not understand quite what she was saying, but in the past 2 decades, it came very clear that those words were prophetic in many ways. And what she was trying to explain to me was that no matter how hard and how long I fight for Emmett Till, I may even attain courtroom justice, which is something that we're still fighting for, but it won't stop all the Emmett Tills of the world from happening. And that's what is glaring, and that's the harsh reality that we're living in, that when we see the slaughter on the streets of America of Black and brown, whether it's at the hands of those who are sworn to protect us or at the hands of white supremacists, these are the Emmett Tills of today that she foresaw, and she knew that we need to understand the connection between her son in 1955 and what's happening on the streets of America. What happened in 1955 and what we're seeing today through many unfortunate deaths are legalized lynchings, I should call them.
Absolutely.
They're one and the same. Emmett Till in those cases are one and the same.
You're absolutely correct. And, even just listening to you, it's almost as though she did pass you the torch. And unfortunately, the torch still continues to need to burn because we still have the same issues. So thank you so much for sharing that piece. We're going to continue to get to know you and continue with our program. Yes. And I want to quote a little something, go back to the movie. So in the movie, Mrs. Till Mobley said, Bo was a perfect baby, born breech and called Bo because of a friend who would bring him gifts in the womb. And so when I think about nicknames and Black nicknames in particular, I recently read an article that stated that Black nicknames are a language of love, protection, and resistance in our communities, almost like a form of endearment and even a rite of passage. And when I think of Bo, I resonated with that because not only is my father, my brother, but also my nephew, their nicknames are Bo. So I wanted to ask you this question and ask if people in the chat would go ahead and share about themselves. What nicknames do you have?
Well, look, oh man, I've been called everything under the sun. My mom calls me Boo. Boo
no,
all the
not
time.
those nicknames.
Boo is a universal nickname for everybody. But no, I never really had a nickname growing up besides my mother giving me one. Okay. And so, I don't take that lightly. I'm very proud of her calling me Boo. I mean, that term.
I love it.
But yes, many of us, you know, especially in the Black community, you know, we love our our nicknames.
Yes, we do.
But I do have a story about the Bo story.
Okay.
As I got closer to Mother Mobley and her husband, Gene Mobley, Mr. Mobley always called me Bo, which is strange because, of course, that's how they addressed Emmett, but they addressed me as Bo because of my last name.
It's fitting. It's definitely fitting.
Yeah. So he would always address me as Bo, and that's some of the finding how should I say, some of the memories I've had with them. And it was just, you know, it's very strange being young and not understanding exactly what you were dealing with, you know, because there were many people along the way that told me that I'm dealing with something that was before my time.
Right.
I didn't quite understand what I had in my hands and what I would be, you know, getting myself into. I was also forewarned about the dangers that I may come across and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But it was a quote by Dr. King that continues to inspire me every day. And that quote is, if a man hasn't found something that's worth dying for, he isn't fit to live.
Yes.
I lived by that quote every day of this journey. I was willing to die to tell this story because I really understood the importance of this story into American history and why we must continue to tell the story today.
That quote is so powerful, and I love you living it. And it's inspiring for us to do the same thing. You know, we even have people in our chat. These nicknames are so good. You know, one of my nicknames is Colioli. My dad and my family calls me Colioli, and then, you know, Nikki to Weed Seed, but we won't get into that. So thank you for sharing your nickname. And thank you everybody in the audience for, you know, coming to the family reunion and sharing those nicknames. Yes, I see you, Shay Shay and TT. So we're going to learn a little bit more about you, and we're going to keep things moving. Right. We're going to play a quick game of quick fire, right? Okay. And so I'm just going to ask you some questions. I'm going to say some words, and you tell me which one you pick. You ready? We're just going to do a few.
Okay.
All right, so the first one is Caribbean beaches or the Rocky Mountains?
Caribbean beaches.
Caribbean beaches. Martin or Fresh Prince?
Martin.
Okay, and chat, you can get in on this too. I see Trinicia is in on it already. Okay, this one's a real important one here, Keith, you know, as a Southern Jaguar myself. So do you prefer Jaguars or Tigers?
Jaguar.
All right. Shout out to all those Jaguars and those SUBR and every HBCU. Shout out, you guys, on the chat. Okay, what about this?
I couldn't have survived without the HBCU community.
Absolutely. So. They are here. They are here, Keith, if you look in that chat. So what about this, gumbo or jambalaya?
Gumbo.
Okay. Frankie Beverly or Earth, Wind, and Fire?
Oh my God, that's a hard one, but Frankie Beverly, of course.
Okay.
But, Frankie Beverly, I like them both. You know, both of those.
I know that was a hard
both of those groups are the soundtrack to my life. You know, that's
I love it. Yes. Now that'll preach. What about
Curtis
Batman
Mayfield,
or Black Panther?
What's that now?
Batman or Black Panther?
Black Panther, of course.
Okay. What about R&B or hip hop?
I'm motivated by both.
Okay.
You know, more R&B when it comes to, you know, a lot of people say that I'm ahead of my times, and I have an old soul as well.
Okay.
And so, you know, music that inspires me, you know, it goes from, you know, people's, oh my God, there's so many people that I'm inspired by. But I like to listen a lot to the songs of the 60s and 70s, and that's Marvin. You know, and Curtis Mayfield is my motivation when I write. You know, I listen to this music because I have to have noise around me when I write my projects and films.
Yes.
And those are that's the music of that time that truly inspires me and motivates me.
I completely understand. And then here's my last one, and then we're going to move forward. Now, this one is very important, so, you know, choose wisely. Pecan or pecan?
Pecan.
Oh, I knew that. I knew that. Louisiana is in the house.
Pecan.
All right, so we're gonna
What's
get.
a pecan? No, I'm saying pecan.
Well, we won't get into that, but you know, I just had to ask. And look in the chat. I mean, we got it's a mixed bag here. So moving on, let's talk a little bit more about the movie. And so there was a moment where, you know, there was a moment, and you'll see 3 different scenes here from the movie. And it starts at the train. In the middle, you see where she is hugging him goodbye. And then that last slide on, well, the last image on the right is she's saying goodbye again.
Yes.
There was the movie moment where she said, be small, be careful, be extra careful. And, you know, we talked about, you know, having the talk and the mother's intuition and really having that conversation, even back in 1955. Parents are still having that today. And so I'd like to pose this question to the chat as well. And I'm going to ask you, Keith, you know, tell me a little bit about why it was so important to put the talk in this movie. And then we're going to actually add someone else to the conversation once you finish.
Okay. Well, first, we decided to put that particular scene in because Mother Mobley prepped her son before he went down south. Now, what people don't realize is that this wasn't the first time Emmett went down south. This is the second time. He was a lot younger. He was 9 years old the first time. And the second time of him going to the South, he's 14 years old. He's just reaching puberty. He gets excited because his cousin, Reverend, Willard Parker at the time, he's a minister now, but Willard Parker was going and he wanted to go with Willard, but to visit his Southern relatives. Now, what occurred is this huge feud. I won't even call it a feud, but this reservation of should he attend or not? Should he go to Mississippi or not? Because that summer, he was to go on a vacation with his mother and Jean Mobley. They were going to Nebraska. And he had just learned how to drive, so he was getting the opportunity to drive on the open road. But he come and makes this decision after Willard Parker, his friend and cousin, come to him and let him know that he's going down south to visit the relatives. And Emmett, of course, makes the decision that he wants to go. And so he goes to his mother, who's very reluctant, but he goes to this grandmother who he knows that he can convince her to take his side. So he went to Alma Spearman and convinced her, and she began to lobby for him as well. Now, what people need to understand about this scene, which is one that I'm very proud that we were able to put in the film, but one that is important because as you can see, the Black male code, specifically those of us from the Deep South as young Black males, we are taught this story. This is something that is part of our makeup. When you reach puberty, this story is told to you so you could be aware of how to navigate through a white dominant society. So most of our brothers and sisters up north, they may have heard bits and pieces of it, but my story and how I discovered Till is not a rare occasion. You could talk to many people and they had that same experience when they first saw that photograph in Jet magazine. Now, what's also important to tell, you tapped on it, and I'm glad that the film was able to touch on it and you get to see it. That Mother Mobley also had her reservations and premonitions of why Emmett should not go. But again, this was Emmett's rites of passage, growing into manhood. So this whole notion of him being held back or should have been held back, I have to say that wasn't the case here. I mean, he had to go. Most men, especially if they're from the North, young boys, when they reach puberty, many of them are sent home down south. It's a culture thing.
Right.
So they can be, learn how to grow up in that kind of environment, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the same with Emmett. He hadn't had a choice, even though Mother Mobley was reluctant, even though she, had premonitions and things, had her reasons why he shouldn't go. She allowed it to take place because this was something traditionally had to be done. I mean, we've all been threatened about, those of us who are from the South, in the suburbs of the city, we were always threatened to be, if we didn't do well or in school or we didn't act right, I'm going to send you to your grandmother or your cousins.
I'm sending you down. Yep, you're going to your cousin.
That's exactly what it is. So it was a cultural thing that occurred. And that's why it was so important to make sure this was put into this film, but also you've already stated, and we all realize, we're living in a harsh society. And what's so sad is that we're continuing to tell our young people, the Black male code, how to survive in this white dominant society. And that's, that's the harsh reality in which we live. And that is just so sad that these conversations have to continue.
Yes, they absolutely have to continue. And even in the chat, I see a lot of people who are telling them they had the chat at 9 and they're having the chat with their kids. It is still happening. And so we are all, familiar. And it's not such a good thing either way, that we still have to have it. Having it because you want to is one thing, but because we have to is another. And so, like I said, I wanted to introduce somebody else who has unfortunately firsthand knowledge of tragically losing a son. Miss Adrienne Hood is a Columbus, Ohio native and is a military veteran who completed an active duty tour in the Army before switching to the Air Force Reserves, of which she retired from December 25th, 2020. She holds a BS in criminal justice admin and an MA in human services with a minor in Christian ministries, and she currently works for the Department of Defense. She's a single mother of a daughter and 2 sons and is the proud grandmother of 3 grandchildren. Now, unfortunately, on June 6, 2016, one of her sons, Henry, was killed by Columbus police. Now, since the tragic killing of Henry, she's become an ambassador for Mothers Against Police Brutality, a nonprofit organization formed to unite mothers who lost their children to police violence. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Adrienne Hood. Round of applause. Welcome, welcome, welcome. How are you, Adrienne?
Good evening, good evening. I am doing well. And I would first like to say again, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak about my son and on behalf of so many, many, many mothers and fathers who unfortunately have become members of the involuntary club, as I call it.
Yes, thank you so much. The pleasure is all ours for having you here. First, we want to say thank you so much for your service to our military. We really appreciate you. You are serving another opportunity. You're taking another opportunity. Well, again, the uninvited club to serve. And we thank you for that as well. So you hear us talking about the talk. We'd like to get your perspective. Did you have the talk with your children? And then what age did you have the talk, if you had it?
Oh, absolutely. So like you said, I have 2 sons. And so the conversation started very early, though I did not go down south. My grandmother's from Alabama, and for whatever reason, we didn't get the answers as to why she never returned to Alabama. So I don't know my family, that is in Alabama. My dad was born in Birmingham. They came here to Columbus, Ohio. This is where I was born and raised, as you stated. I know nothing much about my family from down south, but my grandmother still did her due diligence for us to understand what had transpired. My grandmother was born in 1921. So she, seen a lot. And so as early as my sons could, comprehend, and even my daughter, I used to tell my sons, Unfortunately, in this country, you come out of the womb with 2 strikes against you. You're Black and you're a male. You will always be the #1 threat in this country. At the same time, I did not let that be an excuse for them not to pursue greatness and to be great, right? But we had that conversation very early, and we had that conversation often. If I seen something in the news where, you know, African-American males were being falsely accused, and, you know, any of those situations, we had to come to Jesus. Come on, we got to have this conversation again. And, you know, and this is what it looks like. I need you to avoid this situation. You know, this is how you can get caught up in here. And, you know, if you out with your friends, think about what this consequence could look like. So that was, it was constant, you know, and again, because I'm military, it's just, you know, I believe in situational awareness, knowing your surroundings always. So, you know, I started, unfortunately, I had to start that conversation very early.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate thing, as I mentioned. And I even appreciate the fact that you said you continue to reiterate the situational awareness. And just because you are here or there, you are still a Black man in America with those 2 strikes. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to move forward to another movie moment. And this movie moment is all about community. So one of the things that struck me in the movie is where they were all of her family and friends and mothers, right, were all around her. And she said, one of the mothers, after praying, she said, "He's going to bring him back to you, baby." And that was so profound, because he was brought back to her, but it was on a train, unfortunately, in a coffin. And so one of the other things that what was stated by the wife of Medgar Evers, Mrs. Myrlie Evers, where they were sitting there in Mississippi during the trial, and they were just at the dining room table, again, another element of community. And Miss Myrlie Evers said, "I don't want our children to live in fear." And then Mrs. Till Mobley answered, "We do the best that we can." So Kevin, Keith, I want to go here and say, why was it important to even show the community in this film? Like, what was the community need to do at this point to, you know, just resonate with how community was important then and is still important now?
Yes. Well, in terms of the scene of Mother Mobley, or Danielle, I should say, and Whoopi Goldberg, Albert Spearman, and of course, the friends at the table, it's a known fact that she had a prophetess and members of her church at her home. So she was a God-fearing woman, a woman of the Kojic denomination. Her mother, Alma, was also the matriarch of the family. She was also a mentee to Bishop A.C. Mason, the founder of Kojic Church, as well as Emmett's great uncle, who he went to go visit, Moses Wright. And so they actually founded Kojic churches from the deep south of Mississippi all the way up to Chicago. So they were God-fearing people, but they were also touched, and we touched on it a little bit. Mother Mobley's reaction of Emmett going to Mississippi, how she was reluctant. You could see it in her eyes. She had premonitions. She felt that mother intuition that something could happen. And so in this scene, although we didn't really, we wrote the scene out fully, but we cut it down. The woman who was praying was a prophetess who was with her. And she actually told Mother Mobley at the time exactly where Emmett was going to be found and how. This is how Mother Mobley's transformation had actually begun. One, When she put Emmett on the train, we did not do this. I'm just giving you some backstory.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when Emmett is put on the train and he leaves, the train start pulling out from the train station. In real life, in reality, she collapses. She's not able to walk until days after she finally received the call that Emmett was missing. That was almost a week later. So we couldn't write the film with a woman being in the bed the whole time. So we had to use creative licensing to, show her.
Yeah.
But she was touched. Brother Mobley is clairvoyant. A number of members in our family are clairvoyant as well. And so she saw this happen. Even Emmett's great uncle saw the death of Emmett Till 10 years before it happened. But she talked to me about this vision that she received time and time again from the Creator. The Creator came to her and said that Emmett wasn't hers, that he belonged to him, and that Emmett was here for a greater cause. And this is something that she was able to grasp early on, which is why she was so profound. Now think about this. This is a woman who's 33 years old, and I have to throw this at everybody because people don't realize how young she was.
Yes.
She's 33 years old. From the time of her son's death to the trial of 1955, this is all happening within a 1-month span.
Yeah.
So she becomes an unintentional activist in this world where she has to fight racism, sexism, and all the other isms and gather herself in a manner to fight for justice for her son.
I'd like to think she was almost chosen. I'm getting chills, and I don't know if anybody else is feeling it, but I'm getting chills listening to you share these explicit details about this story that none of us would have ever known without you saying it. So I want to thank you for sharing that. And so, this next question is for Adrian. Another part in the film is where one of the cousins and family lawyers, they told Mrs. Till Mobley, there's no testimony like a mother. And then after the testimony that she did on the stand, she says herself, they killed my son again. And so can you share with us what's one or two things that you testify to regarding your experience that you specifically share with the mothers and their Black sons? Just one or two things.
Oh, wait, one or two things.
Okay, yeah, just try to share one or two things. Yes, I know you can write the book on it.
Yeah. One of the things that I have that I have found that I need to do almost immediately is let the moms or the families know, but usually the reach out is to the mothers first, is to let them know that from the time that their child is murdered, and I'm glad that Keith said the public lynching, because this is a new form of lynching. But I tell them that the clock starts to tick for them as far as a wrongful death suit and and things like that. And so when Keith was just talking about how she couldn't get out of the bed, and I know moms that just could not move. Like they were bedridden and everything, but you only have 2 years to file a wrongful death lawsuit against whatever police department has brought the harm to your child. And
can you say that one more time? I'm going to interrupt because you're dropping facts. That's right. Can you say that one more time just so we can get that?
Yes. So when your child is killed by the police, your clock starts ticking right then. And you have 2 years to, one, find a lawyer that will take the case, right?
because that's a thing, especially if there's any type of questionable circumstances around your child's death. It is hard to get a lawyer.
Right.
It is hard. They just want cut and dry, and that's it.
Wow.
So, I let them know you have 2 years to file that lawsuit, to get an attorney and file that lawsuit. Because if it's after 2 years, it doesn't matter if they were sick, if they were mentally incapacitated. It does not matter. 2 years and you're done.
So what I hear you saying is, as you resonate with the experience that Keith just mentioned, how she not only was clairvoyant and she felt that, her son wasn't coming back, you're telling me you wouldn't have even had a chance. These days, you don't even have a chance to grieve, to be bedridden, to think about your child and make arrangements. You have to immediately get into making decisions about representing his justice, his or her justice. Wow. I'm just getting chills.
You instantly go into fight mode. To be honest, like you said, my son was killed in 2016.
Yes.
I literally just started grieving my son 2 years ago because I learned that about the time, the 2 years. And then on top of that, Ohio is a home rule state, which means that the police department that did the harm up until a year and a half ago, our police department now does independent investigation, but when my son got killed, did not. So with us being a home rule state, whatever jurisdiction does the harm is the same jurisdiction that does the investigation of the murder. So you have police officers investigating their co-workers for the harm. So we fought for independent investigations, and we just got that. The mayor signed an executive order after George Floyd. When they tore this city up,
wow,
he signed an executive order. So those are two of the biggest things that, I get moms, I try and get them to understand. I understand, the pain of it. I understand, but yeah. I'm like, sis, even if I have to carry the torch for them for a little while, we need to get this part rolling, because if we don't, you're going to lose this opportunity to fight for your child.
Yep.
And it's so unfortunate.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems as though if you don't get moving, even though the child is the most important thing to grieve, if you don't get moving and you pass the 2-year date, you'll be grieving even more. Thank you so much for dropping those 2 nuggets. Thank you.
And we have a mom here who now lives with the heaviness of that, because she could not move. She just could not move. And she now deals with that constantly. Yeah. And it's like, I didn't fight for my son. I didn't fight for my son. And it's like, but we didn't know.
Right.
You don't know.
Well, thank God for you being able to carry that torch for them, with them, and, beside them. So thank you so much, Adrian. So as we move forward, we are having such a great conversation, but I know our time is passing. So let's take another look at one more scene. And we're going to just really kind of get into this just a bit. And so in this particular scene, it is the coup de grace, Keith, you've heard me say the pièce de résistance. It is the finale of all finales, of this type of movie. And one of a few of the quotes that I recall from this movie, from this scene that really struck me, is Mrs. Till Mobley said at the NAACP New York, this is toward the end, and she says, if this country fails to protect the Black body from hate, America has yet to meet her promise. She also says either freedom for everybody or freedom fails. And as you can see on the screen, she says, what happens to any of us anywhere in the world had better be the business of us all.
That's correct.
So I want to start with Adrian in this case, and then Keith, I'm going to ask you something specific to this particular part of the movie. So Adrian, in 1957, the Civil Rights Act was directly impacted by the actions of Mrs. Till Mobley, and we've heard that already. And on March 29th, 2022, not even a year from today, we're in March right now, hadn't even been a year, 67 years after his murder, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was signed into law. Why do you think it seems the legislative system is more reactive versus proactive in the justice system? What are your thoughts to Black and brown people specifically?
And you said it right there, to Black and brown part, right, specifically, you know, and that is that's so unfortunate. Like I promise you, until I got in this space, I didn't even realize that lynching was something that we was even still arguing about. Whew. I said, are you kidding me right now? That is something that we are still fighting to make illegal? Like shooting someone is illegal. So you telling me that lynching is not? Like, I did not even understand why that was even still an issue. But like you said, it's Black and brown bodies. That's why it's reactive as opposed to proactive. It shows the value and the worth of us still to this day in this country, which is, I mean, again, it's so unfortunate because without us, this country would not exist. Let's just be honest about that. It would not exist. And so for that to still be something that we had to continue to use a battering ram, right? A battering ram to keep coming after that wall, to knock that wall down in order to get this legislation passed is shameful. And it is absolutely has more to do with it being Black and brown bodies that were on the receiving end. On the receiving end of it, that it has been more reactive than it is proactive.
Yeah, so basically what I hear you saying is, again, the quote from the movie, America has yet to meet her promise, is what I'm hearing you say. So,
and that kind of ties back to a quote of Martin Luther King's about America writing us a blank check.
Ooh, Look, that'll preach, but we're not gonna get into that tonight.
We're not.
So I appreciate you for sharing, Adrian. And so Keith, I just wanted to, again, about this scene. I know also in the movie, Dr. Howard used his resources to aid in the fight for justice. And as the fight continues, what are some ways, one or two ways that we can be impactful to the justice fight today?
Well, one is acknowledging that the struggle of 1955 is no different from the struggle that we're having today, which is, again, the importance of telling this story time and time again. Because, you know, the fight for civil and human rights in this country has cosmetically changed, but it's still the same fight. We're still fighting the same exact social ills that are transgenerational. So one, acknowledge that these ills exist and understand when they're transgenerational, it may take a generation or two to fix. Rome wasn't built overnight. We know this. So we just have to first understand what we're dealing with, which is why it was so hard to get this film made. For 67 years, many have tried to produce this film on Emmett Till. From William Bradford Huey, who was a reporter in 1955, who allegedly got the men to confess for $4,000. However, it wasn't really a confession. The $4,000 was a depiction agreement, monies for a depiction agreement, because he wanted to produce a film on Till called Wolf Whistle. It was foiled by Mother Mobley in the early 60s. Mother Mobley herself had 2 film deals in 1956, but was not able to get them made because, one, people thought it was going to incite riots, and of course, it was the time. Also, we must understand in 55, and listening to Mrs. Hood, also in 1955, there were no laws protecting African Americans, no civil rights laws that exist.
No laws. No loss.
No loss.
Mm-hmm.
No
now
loss. So that's the difference.
No
that's the contrast from what we're seeing today versus yesterday. And with, of course, Ms. Hood mentioned the importance of this first 2 years to get an attorney and to file a wrongful death lawsuit. But that deals with everything civil. I mean, the time starts when the death occurs. So what we've been fighting on the Emmett Till end, it's all, the laws that existed in 1941, because in 1941 laws that actually applies in 1955, with statute of limitations in terms of civil rights violations only held a 5-year statute of limitation. Perjury only held a 2-year statute of limitation. So I don't want to get into all that history, but I'm trying to get people to understand the importance of this story and how important it is to put this story in its proper context and history so we understand where we must go today. Absolutely. So in 1954, you had Brown versus Board of Education, the biggest landmark decision won by the NAACP, ending, of course, segregation in public schools, right? Mm-hmm. Right off the heels of this decision that was made, you had the formation of the Citizens Council, who was outraged by this big win, who vowed to bring a reign of terror throughout the South, in particular Mississippi, because in 1955, it was an election year. So they vowed to bring a reign of terror out in the summer of 1955. 2 months prior to Emmett's arrival, you have the murder of Reverend George Lee out of Belzoni, Mississippi, who was an NAACP official. He was also a member of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, the organization that was founded by Dr. T.R.M. Howard. He was Dr. Howard's closest friend. Yes. This happens 2 months prior to Emmett's arrival. He's coming home from a speaking engagement on May 7th, 1955. He is shot while driving home from a speaking engagement, and he was killed because of his advocacy of trying to register Black voters. So when we talk about the importance of voting, and we always talk about or hear people talk about stories of people had died for us to vote. These are the people. And I personally investigated. I personally investigated these cases. Yes. And so 2 weeks prior to Emmett's arrival, you have the murder of Lamar Ditley Smith out of Brookhaven, Mississippi, who was a civil rights leader, World War I vet, NAACP member, and a member of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. He is shot on the courthouse lawn in broad daylight on August 13, 1955, in front of close to 100 people trying to register Black voters. In both cases, many knew who the shooters were, but they were never brought to the court of law and served, of course, any time. This is the atmosphere Emmett Till walks into. The cotton curtain, they call it, because the Delta of Mississippi is a total different beast from anywhere else around the country. This is where that Dixiecrat hatred comes from. In 1955, Mississippi was known to be the free state, which meant that no outside influences could come in to intervene. So this is the southern door Emmett Till walks into. And of course, he meets his fate when he whistles at Carolyn Bryant at the country store. But when his deaths happen, when his lynching takes place, he instantly becomes the poster child to the next biggest movement that was being pushed, which was the anti-lynching crusade.
Absolutely. And when I hear you talk about this, I hear, when you go back to that one, first thing we need to do is acknowledge. That's a key word, and that's the hashtag as well. We have to acknowledge. If you don't know where you're from or what has happened in the past, if you don't know your history, you will be lost in where you're going. And so we're going to keep going. And so
better yet, if we forget our past, history will repeat itself.
Absolutely.
And that is exactly what is happening today. And people are wondering why. Now, we've been longing for a new movement for change. We've been longing for it for a while. Whenever, you see Black and brown slaughtered on the streets of America, we have this moment where we're all collectively trying to figure out ways to get together to fight this social ill. We've come close many times. The last time was George Floyd, and when Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, all these cases happening at one time. We were yearning for it. But the reason why we haven't quite reached that pinnacle, that moment, is because we don't know how it started. Movements of racial progression in America has only happened through the blood and the sweat and the death of the Black body. There's no other way it has ever happened. If we could arguably say that the civil rights movement was the greatest movement ever produced by citizens of this country, the greatest movement of any day, the most successful of any time, then you must look at the story of Emmett Till and the courageous actions of his mother and understand what they actively done in 1955 to get us to this point. And that's only then when you understand that, which is the reason why this film was never made in 67 years. It's only then when you understand that story will we begin to connect the dots and understand how a new movement has to become active today.
Absolutely. And I want to take time to make a quick plug. If you haven't seen the movie or seen a movie, or even, I mean, clearly everybody on here clearly has an understanding of who Emmett Till is. And even, you know, it's National Women's Month. So we're celebrating, you know, Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley. And so go see the movie. It's now streaming on Amazon Prime. And take a look at the movie because it is from the perspective of a beautiful mother. So as we move forward, we wanted to take a few questions. I know we are getting close to the finish line. So we're only going to take 2 questions, right? So this is a chance for those who are joining us to interact with our guests. So if you're going to ask a question via chat, please go ahead and type the word question first, then add your question to help us identify your inquiry. We'll take 1 or 2 questions from there, and then we'll move forward. So again, this is your opportunity to interact with our guests. We'll give a few moments.
And while the moments are going, you know, you mentioned the quote at the end of the film. The full quote is this: 2 months ago, I had a nice apartment in Chicago. I had a job.
Yes.
I had a son. When something happened to the Negroes in the South, I said, that's their business, not mine. Now I know how wrong I was. The murder of my son has shown me that what happens to any of us anywhere in the world had better be the business of us all. Now, that quote really sums up my Shiro, our Shiro, the best, because most of us, we look at status as being reasons why we won't have this encounter, or we feel invincible, that it would never happen to our child, our son, or our cousins, our relative, right? Because of status. And unfortunately, she was rudely awakened by the tragedy of the loss of her son. And that changed her tragectory, completely mindset. Because think about it, we're still dealing with these issues today. Well, absolutely. Where individuals feel like they're not so much in touch with what's happening in the world, right? Or it's not that their obligation. My frustration, because I deal with a lot of families, and Ms. Hood, I deal with a lot of families who lost their loved ones to police violence as well, but it's the same reoccurring thing. A lot of these mothers never really thought they would put themselves in this activism position.
Absolutely.
As Ms. Hood said, nobody want to be a part of that club.
Yeah.
But it happens. And it becomes a wake-up call to many of these mothers and fathers who thought because of status, these things would never happen to their loved one. Yeah. And so Mother Mobley wasn't perfect. That was her view at first. But then it ended up at her front door. And what is happening, we don't see a lot of people on the front lines when these things happen. I mean, there's a lot of young people out there giving the energy, but people who can actually move and shape things, people who can make a difference. We don't get a lot of those people out on the front lines, when it happens. But when it hits them at their front door,
Yes.
Then they realize how wrong they are. And that's why I love that quote.
Yeah, and it speaks to when Aunt Lizzie was at the viewing, when she told, she said, Tilly, I can't look. And so many of us, unfortunately, we have the spirit of I can't look. I don't want to see the video because it's so hurtful. I don't want to show, my emotion because it's the same video, just another Black son. But we have to be forthright to look. We have to see. And so that way, just because it's not in our neighborhood, because it's not over here, it's not that far that it could be us. So I do see one question in the chat. And that question, I believe, came from Kim Weaver. She says, can we expect another great film or story of our Black history from you? I'm assuming that question is to you, Keith.
Absolutely. My whole body of work has been, and I don't want to make it sound depressing, but look, I'm known for investigating unsolved civil rights murders and bringing exposure to the everyday injustices that we're faced. There were things that Mother Mobley instilled in me before she passed away. One of the things was that we discussed and talked about was at the time in 1955, when her son got all this recognition and support, and the media was all over the story, she felt very guilty about it. And the reason why she felt guilty about it, because she knew other mothers were suffering from the similar things and would never have that opportunity and that platform like she had. Wow. So she devoted her life until her last breath to make sure other mothers have these platforms when their loved ones is unfortunately lives are cut short. So this was one of the things that I promised her, that I would do everything in my power to make sure that we get justice in Emmett Till's case. But also in the midst of this, I will also, if I had the platform, to be able to pursue other civil rights murder cases in hopes of providing a platform for the families to tell their loved one's story. Because many of these mothers, and I know that Ms. Hood could attest to this, many of the mothers of the movement of this, of this collective group, they are all fighting to make sure that their loved ones did not die in vain. Yes. And that came from Mother Mobley. And many of them would tell you they looked to her journey to get that courage to move ahead. And again, and this is why it's so important to tell this story. Emmett Till is the Anne Frank of Black America. His death continues to serve as a reminder of grave injustice, but as well as hope and change. It was change that came out of the murder of Emmett Lewis Till. It's because of Rosa Parks, Emmett Till, that Rosa Parks made her courageous decision not to get up from her bus in Montgomery, Alabama. It's because of Emmett Till's death that a 26-year-old Martin Luther King decided to take on the Montgomery bus boycott, because he felt that the murder of Emmett Till was an intimidation factor to keep Black people away from the voting polls. Wow. This is why it's so important to understand the connection and why we call Emmett the catalyst that sparked the American Civil Rights Movement. Before we go further, quick fun fact. Why was August 28th?
Okay, go ahead. You said
August 28th, the date of August 28, 1963, the March on Washington, right? The I Have a Dream speech. Why was that date chosen? Do you notice that?
Well, because his murder was in August 1955.
August 1955, August 28 to be exact. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who was organizers at the March on Washington, chose that date because they wanted to channel the energy, that fight that came out of the death of Emmett Till that sparked the movement. So that's why that date was chosen.
Gotcha. Again, thank you. I have learned so much. I mean, I thought I knew, but clearly tonight I have been learned a lot more about, as my grandmama would say, let me learn you something, right? So what I hear as it relates to that question is that there's an opportunity for more for us to learn, whether it be through the movie or through just continue to have these conversations. Your fight continues, as does ours, but I love the fact that you made good on your promise to, as you call her, Mother Mobley. And so as we move forward, we're going to continue and just say thank you so much to both of our guests. Everybody give them a round of applause, please, and let's celebrate them for being justice seekers. So thank you, Ms. Adrienne Hood. Yeah.
Can I say one other thing?
Absolutely.
Well, actually, it's a request. It's a request for all of y'all to please keep me lifted up in prayer, because I am running for city council. And I'm running against an incumbent. So I just want to, for y'all to just, anytime that you think about me, just ask God to just continue to cover me, because it's not easy, you know, to continue to say my son's story and whatnot. But I feel like he has called me to this moment at this particular time. And so, you know, to make the changes here locally, for our police department and our community on other things. But I am going to do this on this year. And so I'm just asking for everyone to just continue to lift me up in prayer. And I tell y'all, thank you in advance for the prayers, because I need them all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you can see, we were going to get to that, but I love it. I love a good old lead in, you know. So if you can see in the chat, you'll see information from Mr. Keith Beauchamp, and then you'll also see ways of how to contact Miss Adrienne Hood. And so we're not quite finished, because now it's the call. You know, when you go to sit down and eat, you get an appetizer, but you got to get the dessert, as my mom would get that first, but you get the meal and then the dessert. And so we want to make sure that we communicate with you what our actions are from this point on. So speaking of justice seekers, I want to introduce my soror, Mrs. Tracy Rainey.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all have been inspired as much as I have on tonight. I am Tracy Rainey. I get to serve as one of the co-chairs of our Social Action Committee here at the Metropolitan Dallas Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We work to advocate for the rights of our community. And as we talk about the pursuit of justice, we have a fight that we have to continue. So, you know, you always see Deltas out in the streets, in the community, registering people to vote. We've been working on ways of not only getting people registered, but also getting them to the poll. But even that is not enough. Whether you voted for someone or not, they're in office to represent you and your needs. And so we have to hold them accountable. Our call to action tonight is to talk about the George Floyd Act of 2021. We know that it was created to address issues with accountability in law enforcement and policing practices. So yes, bills are often given names that stem from something that happened. But let's be clear, this bill is to protect the rights and of all citizens and to hold all police accountable. This was first introduced in 2021, and here we are in 2023. And the bill still has no movement. It was passed in the House, but lay dormant and killed in the Senate. So we have other cases of citizens' death at the hands of police that have lacked accountability. It is imperative that we impress upon our senators the importance of this bill and the will of our communities that they represent and serve. The Social Action Committee is now asking you to take the next step in writing to your senators. You can do it either electronically or you can do it by mail. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen, we've made it simple for you. There's a form letter already there that talks about what the Policing Act is all about. It gives you the reasons of why it's important to be shared, why it's important that it needs to be passed. You can either copy and paste that letter and send it electronically to your senators, or you can print it out and mail it. If you don't know who your senator is, the link is at the bottom. You can go to www.senate.gov. There, you'll find a place where you can input your address, and it'll let you know who your senators are, and it'll give you that contact information. So They mentioned earlier that it took almost 70 years to pass the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. We don't want the same thing to happen for this George Floyd Policing Act. We ask that you speak up now. Take action now. Thank you so much for your time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Tracy. As we move forward, to Tracy's point, we have to have action. And so again, we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Our two guests, Mr. Keith Beauchamp, Ms. Adrienne Hood. We want to thank all of the people who have joined us. We want to thank our special guests, whether you're a family member, a friend of Keith or Adrienne. And we just want to thank you from across the country for indulging in this conversation. It is our desire that this conversation brought healing, reconciliation, forgiveness, and hope. Keep in mind that the Arts and Letters and the Social Action Committee members, we truly appreciate your time and attendance tonight. And so we want to say Asante Sana, which means thank you very much in Swahili. Your presence tonight has been a testimony to the dedication of a mother, Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley. She sought justice for her beloved son, Emmett. Now, to ensure that the MDA chapter continues to provide impactful programming to our communities, both near and far, your feedback is important to us. So what you see on the screen right now, we're asking you to consider sharing that feedback right now and let us know how your overall experience was. Go ahead and scan that QR code on the screen. And if you have any questions, our chat monitors can assist you via the chat. We want to thank you in advance for providing your feedback. Now we're going to turn it over to the MDA chapter president, Mrs. Tanya Moriguri, to provide closing remarks. Tanya?
Thank you so much, Sarah Horn. Wow, wow, wow is all I can say, right? This was absolutely amazing. To Mr. Keith Beauchamp and Ms. Adrienne Hood, thank you for being justice seekers and sharing your personal experiences. Thank you for honoring Ms. Mamie Till Mobley and sharing the story of her personal and private grief that led to her public action that we are still fighting today. Thank you to the Arts and Letters Committee led by SARS Nicole Horn and Jordania Lilly, as well as our Social Action Committee led by SARS Tracy Rainey and Cheryl Jones. And on behalf of the officers and members of the Metropolitan Dallas Alumni Chapter, thank you to everyone that joined us today. And I continue to encourage you to be the change for police reform. You heard the call from our Social Action Committee. Get your letters to your senators today. Let's make sure we all do our part. Thank you so much and have a great night.